Hi, my name is Tim. Join me in this video as I discuss what to say to somebody who says, I am not going to be following any FAA regulations when it comes to drone flights. Let's get to it. So I get a lot of comments on this channel, very interesting comments from viewers, and I appreciate them. And I realize a lot of these viewers are new to the FAA regulations, the fact that there's a national airspace system, and that we're being covered by regulations for the first time really in the modeling community. The focus is going to be remote ID. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But I'd like to have a little bit of talk during this video of the FAA regulations. Can they do regulations? Are the regulations legal? How does the FAA enforce these regulations against drone pilots, and what does the future hold as the FAA learns how to deal with drone pilots, the National Airspace System, and the various local law enforcement agencies throughout the country? In addition, I'll give you a story towards the end about a pilot, full-scale pilot, airline pilot, who was sent to jail for 16 months for violating an FAA regulation. True story. Thank you for tuning in. Again, there are chapters in the timeline. Just hover over that. You can see where we are in the video. Also, I truly appreciate any likes and subscribes for the channel. They truly help with the algorithm, so thank you for taking the time to do that. So what has happened recently in the past few years to get the FAA involved with modeling activities is the requirement by Congress on the FAA about 2019 or so to come up with some way of remote ID, remote identification of drones flying in the airspace of the United States. The reason for this is a lot of drones flying where they're not supposed to be, in controlled airspace, over crowds, crashing into public areas. And the FAA realized with full-scale aircraft, they generally can get a hold of the pilot, because they can meet the pilot when he or she lands the aircraft. With drones, they don't necessarily know that the drone's flying in the airspace or where it took off. Remote ID is a way to potentially solve that problem. I have many other videos on the remote ID, but just as a very quick overview, the ID is kind of like a digital license plate in the sky for drone operations. There is nothing anybody needs to do on remote ID to be compliant until September 16th, 2023. This is being filmed in June of 2023. So until September 16th, nobody has to do anything. There are 3 phases of remote ID. The first one is manufacturers have to build compliant drones. By and large, that's on track. Taking a look at the FAA website. So for sure, any drone that you purchase new after September 16th, 2023 will be remote ID compliant. The other thing is what is called FRIAs. It's an FAA recognized identification area. The FAA is in the process of designating for model airplane flight, primarily Academy of Model Aeronautic Airfields as a FRIA. It's a FAA recognized identification area. It means you can fly in a FRIA once they're approved by the FAA without the need for any remote ID capability. The issue that is still unresolved, and it's a pretty big problem in my view, is what if you don't buy a new drone with remote ID or you're not flying in a FRIA? The answer is you have to have a remote ID module. This is a small module that you can buy one for all your airplanes for recreational flyers. You plug it into your aircraft, and wherever you're flying in the United States, you will be compliant with the remote ID ruling. There's a few for sale at around $200. That's way too much money, in my view, for the recreational flyer. We're still not at September 16th. We'll have to wait and see when we get closer to that date. I believe one or two things will happen. There will be affordable remote ID modules, or the FAA will slip the date. We won't know that until much closer. But because of this focus on the FAA on regulations, regulating drones, this is all very new stuff to the modeling community. There's a lot of people that say, well, I'm just not going to comply with the FAA regulations. I'm not near a club. I fly up in the middle of nowhere, Montana, North Dakota, and I'm just not going to comply with that. So what I want to do is give some background and context on the FAA regulations, how they view drones, and then just so you have a better understanding of where the FAA is coming on that, and then at the end I'll reach some conclusions. Where I'm coming from, I've been flying either light aircraft or commercially basically my whole life. So I'm very familiar with regulations, the need for regulations, how regulations contribute to safety. So I don't really mind too much following regulations. For a lot of RC model pilots that may never have followed a regulation in their life from the FAA, this is all very new stuff. And I understand that. So let's start off at the beginning. I've had some commenters on my videos say, well, geez, we're flying this toy, this drone, this small quadcopter. I'm not really a pilot. And that is not correct. In the definitions of the FAA, they defined a pilot in command is the person who, quote, has final authority and responsibility for the operation and safety of the flight. Now, obviously, that's written for full-scale aircraft, but that applies to your drone. If you're flying and operating that drone, you're the pilot in command, and you're responsible for where that drone goes, what it does, what it doesn't do, just from the FAA's viewpoint. Another important background item for thinking about the FAA and drones is who has authority for the airspace versus the land and property when you're flying a drone. That's a very valid question, and one, frankly, the FAA is wrestling with right now. So, to quote from an FAA recent press statement, the FAA says there is still confusion on whether cities and municipalities can enforce their own drone laws governing the operation of aircraft. To clear up any misunderstandings on local and federal drone regulations, the FAA issued a statement. And what the FAA says is that Congress has supplied the FAA with the exclusive authority to regulate aviation safety, to include navigation in the air traffic control, things of that nature. This is an important point. State and local governments are not permitted to regulate any aircraft operations such as flight paths or altitudes or the navigable airspace. State and local authorities may determine the takeoff and landing area for drones, but only the FAA has authority to control the national airspace. Laws traditionally related to state and local jurisdiction include laws about land use, zoning, privacy, and law enforcement operations. These types of laws are not subject to federal regulation. What that means to us as drone pilots, RC airplane pilots, when we're operating in the national airspace system, that's the airspace above the ground, the FAA has the final authority for what is controlled airspace, uncontrolled airspace, the class of the airspace, and so forth. Where you see this come up from time to time, a local city, say Arlington, Virginia, doesn't like the noise of jets out of Washington National Airport. Arlington, Virginia cannot tell National Airport to close by 10 o'clock at night, or they have to fly certain areas to minimize the noise. That only is the responsibility of the FAA. Another item to keep in mind is the FAA does not have its police force to enforce these regulations. As I'll cover later on, the FAA only does civil actions. That means a fine or some certificate action. The FAA cannot pursue criminal activities. Criminal activities involve loss of liberty. That means going to jail. If you violate an FAA regulation, it is just civil law, penalty, certificate action, not going to jail. And so what's happening is the FAA will partner with local law enforcement in the case of drones, because very often the drones will be violating a local town or city ordinance, say privacy, flying over property. The FAA spokesman continued, it says, the FAA says it is up to state and local law enforcement to crack down on rogue drone pilots. And what the FAA does is they've issued guidance that officers collect evidence of illegal drone flights and immediately notify the nearest FAA Regional Operations Center if the FAA is going to take any further action on that. This also comes into play, for example, when you see passengers on airliners not following the instructions of a crew member. Clearly the FAA regulates those crew members, the operation of that aircraft, but it's always the local police that come on board to arrest those people, escort them off the aircraft, take any further actions after their disruption on the aircraft. It's not an FAA police force. I've received some comments on the channel talking about FAA regulations in general, and one viewer said that it's unconstitutional for the FAA to write regulations. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows the FAA to write these rules that have the force of law. And that's not correct. There are two spheres of laws in the United States, the U.S. Code and the Code of Federal Regulations. The U.S. Code are laws passed by Congress You may be, say, an amendment to a constitution, the Congressional Act setting up NASA in 1958, the Affordable Care Act. These are all acts of Congress that are public law. However, in any advanced country like the United States, many others around the world, there are executive offices that have a great deal of responsibility for the way we want to safely live our life, and Congress has authorized these executive offices to set up their own regulations under administrative law concept that have the force of law from these regulations. Congress will work very closely with these agencies to make sure they're following congressional intent, but there's so much complexity. These agencies can do these things. An example would be the Food and Drug Administration. We all want to make certain that our food is safe. We can go to the hospital for emergency care. The drugs are what they're prescribed to be. The FDA passes regulations that ensures all these things meet our requirements in the United States. And the Code of Federal Regulations is a list of about 50 titles that cover various agencies that are authorized to write these regulations and then follow through on them. Title 14 is the FAA, and they're allowed to write regulations under that authority. Now, what will happen with the FAA, because there's a wide range of activities and regulations such as aircraft design, how to maintain aircraft, airline flights, pilot training, hot air ballooning, lighting for towers. It is even so involved with the FAA. I found this out today, literally. There is a FAA regulation on kites. And as part 104, it covers kites that weigh more than 5 pounds. Their kites are intended to be flown at the end of a rope or a cable, and things that are covered in the kite, they can't fly in any restricted or prohibited areas. They have to fly below 500 feet AGL, above ground level. They have to be at least 5 miles away from an airport. So the FAA covers a lot of things in the regulations, to include things like remote ID for drone operations. So the remote ID is a pretty good example of how the FAA writes these very important regulations. The FAA will gather, do a lot of work to write the regulation. It is a proposed regulation at this point. The FAA has to publish it as a proposed new regulation. It goes out for a 60-day comment period on the remote ID ruling. They get about 54,000 comments from modelers and other people. I sent in a comment. The FAA will receive those comments, decide what to do. They really go through each comment. Then at the end, they'll list the final regulation. When it's published in the Federal Register, it becomes a regulation that has the force of law that we have to follow. That happened with remote ID. Per the ID rules, the manufacturers have to be compliant, and we have until September 16th, 2023 before we have to follow the remote ID ruling. One thing that I want to emphasize in this video is when we're talking about drones, we're still at the very early stages of this whole remote ID. Remember, it doesn't kick in until September 16th of 2023. The FAA is feeling the way around with drone operations. The FAA, just like with regular aircraft, they look differently at commercial operations versus recreational activities for pilots. Same for drone operators. If you're a recreational pilot, the FAA is not spending too much time to look at your activities unless you do something that I'll talk about later, like an airspace violation where they have to act. And the other thing is the FAA spokesman adds that the agency for the drone operations, because this is new ground, they're interested in safety. So what the FAA would like to do is educate, not punish violators, since it's still, to their words, a lack of public knowledge about how to legally fly drones. Another thing that's important for flying your drone, because we have certificates for recreational pilots, it's a trust certificate. If you're flying commercially, it's a Part 107. You get an actual license from the FAA or certificate from the FAA for those operations. That flying is a privilege, it's not a right, and privileges, just like your driver's license, can be taken away if you don't follow certain rules. Just like with a driver's license, if you get if you're convicted of drunk driving, you could lose your license for a period of time. Same thing with your pilot's license. It could be suspended for a period of time for a regulation violation. It could be revoked for a more serious violation. Remember, as I said before, the FAA is administrative law, fines, suspend, revoke certificates. They can't send you to jail. That is under criminal law, to be a separate discussion at the end. Also, for the violations of regulations, the FAA does have their own legal section. It's the Aviation Litigation Division, and that's the legal enforcement arm of the FAA for enforcing FAA regulations. So what are the three areas that the FAA appears to be focusing on for violations and drone pilots? There are three areas that the FAA is looking at. It's airspace, flying over people, and crashing your drone. So the first is airspace violations. As part of their FAA's approach towards air safety is they have different rules for controlled airspace to determine who is in it, what their training is, who they're talking to. The three most restrictive areas of controlled airspace that affect drone pilots are Class B, Class C, Class D airspace. There's various apps before you fly, etc., that can determine where you are. But the bottom line is, before a drone operator ever flies into Class B, C, or D airspace, they need prior clearance from the FAA, because the whole point is the FAA is talking to other aircraft in that controlled airspace. If you fly a drone in Class B, C, or D airspace, typically with a remote ID, they will know about it. They will know your takeoff location once that comes into effect on September 16th. For now, it's sightings by other aircraft. There is a UAS sightings report on the FAA website. There's easily 30 sightings of unauthorized drone operations in controlled airspace each week as we get towards the end of 2022. This is what will get the FAA's immediate attention. The other problem is flying over people. This is a more common problem than you realize. The FAA prohibits flying over people unless the people are involved in an operation or they're under some protective structure or in a car, just so they can't get hit by the drone. And what will typically happen is there'll be some public event. It could be a sports stadium, a football game, a concert. Somebody wants nice pictures of that, they fly the drone over it, and they're immediately hit with that violation and then get reported up from there. The other activity on drones that will pretty much force FAA action on some level is a loss of control or a crash of the drone. There's a difference on crashing the drone. If you crash in your private property in North Dakota or Montana, the FAA will probably never know about it. However, there have been a lot of crashes of drones in fairly public places like parades, sports stadiums, the middle of a busy city. Obviously, that's going to get the FAA's attention. They'll look at the circumstances, partner with local law enforcement to see what local rules have been broken versus the FAA rules. And there's always a laundry list of FAA regulations that can be brought to bear to include things as basic as careless and reckless operation if you have a crash. One other point that I want to emphasize on any video I make with the FAA and airspace, outside of the fact that you could be in the middle of nowhere or near Los Angeles Airport with Class B airspace, there's another gotcha called a TFR, or a temporary flight restriction. They're called temporary flight restrictions because they are temporary. The worst case possible is with presidential movement. When Air Force One goes anywhere, there's a 30-mile TFR around where that plane is parked or the presidential party. Those TFRs are taken very seriously. You could be in the middle of nowhere. If Air Force One is at Minot Air Force Base, there's a 30-mile TFR around where that airplane is. That airspace is monitored very closely. There are people in Black Hawk helicopters and fighter aircraft that patrol those areas. If you fly a full-scale Piper Cub or your model and you're caught in a TFR, that is a very serious issue. Just be aware that they can pop up at various places, to include sporting events. When you have the Super Bowl, there is a TFR, and those are taken very seriously by the FAA for an airspace violation. Now, before I conclude this video on what to do if you decide I'm just not going to follow FAA regulations, to kind of bookend the discussion, I want to talk about the commercial pilot who spent 16 months in federal prison for lying to the FAA on a medical application. This actually happened. It occurred back in 2005. It was a pilot on Cape Air flights. Cape Air Flight is a local New England airliner. They fly twin engine Cessna aircraft. Very challenging flying because it's single pilot operation in very busy terminal airspace, but they could fly people to Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket and things like that. But the key thing is there's only one pilot on board these aircraft. There is no co-pilot. And what had happened, this pilot, name's not important, but he was at the controls of the aircraft and he passed out due to a reaction to his diabetes. So diabetes is obviously a very serious medical condition. You want to have a full conversation with your FAA medical examiner. And as a very general rule, if you can bring your diabetes under control through diet and exercise, you can continue to be a commercial pilot. If, however, you're taking insulin, you have to inject to maintain your diabetes under control, that is a different discussion. You're probably going to lose your medical. Individual circumstances vary. But what had happened was this pilot had developed diabetes. It required insulin to control the diabetes. He did not tell the examiner on that because you fill out a very detailed questionnaire before you go in for your periodic FAA medical exam. For commercial pilot under 60 years of age, it's every year you have to take it. Over 60, it's every 6 months. He did not tell the examiner that he was using insulin to control his diabetes. Sure enough, he was on a flight. There were 4 passengers on the flight. Luckily, one of the passengers had 48 hours worth of flight instruction time. The pilot passed out. The student pilot talked to controllers via her cell phone, landed the aircraft gear up. Nobody got hurt. And of course, the pilot went to court, pled guilty. It was 16 months in jail, 2 months under probation. So I mentioned earlier, the FAA can't put people in jail. How did this happen? If there are serious incidences going on like this that endanger the lives of commercial passengers, the FAA can go to its boss, the Department of Transportation. DOT can reach over to the Department of Justice. They'll bring in the FBI. The FBI will determine if a crime was committed. In this case, they did, and that's what happened to get this pilot to jail. I don't envision anything like that happening with drone operations, but the FAA, this is just part of what they do. This is an extreme example. So what do you do if it's on September 16th, there's no extension of the remote ID date, there's no affordable remote ID modules? What are your courses of action? As a personal decision, I am fortunate that I'm a member of a local RC club. We will have our FRIA in place by that time, talking to club officers. So I'll fly at my club. I don't need to do anything. I'll be remote ID compliant because I'm at that club. It'll be a personal decision if you are flying outside of a FRIA or club airspace without the remote ID module. The FAA is looking very closely at the commercial operators, more so than the recreational operators. It'll be an individual choice what you do at that time. I believe we will have affordable remote ID modules by that September implementation date. I also believe the FAA will take a common sense approach. I may be completely wrong on this, but if there are not feasible remote ID module solutions, they'll extend the date. We'll have to wait to see what happens on that. Again, thank you for tuning into this video. I do want to thank you for joining me in this conversation about the FAA regulations, how they regulate, do they enforce the regulations, are the regulations legal? And we're in very uncharted territory with this whole remote ID thing because everything is new. The equipment, the regulations, the implementation by the modeling community. I think there's going to be more to follow. And let's just wait to see till we get closer to that date how things are going to be turning out. Thank you.